Today we've got Dr. Matthew Thiessen with me. And no, Reliant K's frontman did not just get a PhD. This is a different Matt Thiessen. And I'm just so excited. This is like, I feel bad for you. It's got to be like one of the most like common things that happen to you because you're also in the Christian world. Like it's got to be just something that happens all the time. I remember a number of years ago, there was this commercial and it was like this guy whose name is Michael Jordan, but it was just like some regular guy. And every time, like, like when the mailman would come to his door or whoever it was, always thinking like, oh, it's the real Michael Jordan. And then you see just like this average looking white
Yeah.
guy. And it's like, oh, really? So do you feel like you get that all the time where it's like, oh, Matt Thiessen, wow. And then they find out, oh, it's just a biblical scholar.
Yeah, it's not quite as regular as Michael Jordan, but it's still there. So yeah, I've gotten emails, social media. I've even had phone calls to my house when I used to have a landline, asking
Wow.
asking if I'm the famous Matt Thiessen, and so
The one and only.
it's pretty humbling. Yeah.
I bet. I bet. Wonderful. Well, you do a lot of really cool stuff in the world. You're associate professor of religious studies at McMaster University in Ontario, and you recently wrote an incredible book called A Jewish Paul, and the subtitle is "The Messiah's Herald to the Gentiles." I loved it. I think it's so cool. It's so great, and it really brought a different perspective about Paul that I don't really think I've encountered so much. So it just was a really cool read. I'm excited to chat about it. But before we dive into the book, I want to know, who is Matthew Thiessen to Matthew Thiessen?
That's a great question. Why didn't you prepare me for that? I feel pretty much like a little small town yokel, Canadian yokel, still, even though I've transcended any levels of success I ever could have dreamed for myself, um, as minimal as they were. I'm just a small town regular guy living in Hamilton, Ontario, and living the dream of getting to teach and read and write about things that interest me, which are mostly the Bible and the ancient world. That's me.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
So let's kind of dive into a little bit of the book before we get into the context of contents of the book. You being a religious studies professor, right? You're reading theology, you're reading Bible stuff all the time. And so, like, I would imagine when you go into writing a project like this, you already have a really good sense of a lot about Paul and thinking about, all right, how is Paul Jewish? But there's got to be something that comes up in the research of this book that
Yeah.
you're like, whoa, I did not know that before. So maybe there was something theological or maybe something biblical that came up while researching for this book that you didn't know before. Was there anything like that that came up?
Yeah. So I have a confession to make. This book
Well,
is
I'm not ordained probably in your tradition, but we can try to
no,
figure it
and
out.
I should never confess to a clergy member in my tradition. The This book is really based on a previous book that's much longer and much more detailed, and I think probably more boring at the end of the day. So I didn't learn like a whole lot more in the writing of this book. I did learn some small things, but in the writing of that book, which this book is based on, it was really thinking about the resurrection body in Paul's thought that uh, I was sort of floored by stuff that I
Mm.
thought I knew, and then I'm just stumbling across thing after thing after thing about how ancients thought about the heavenly realm and what that could mean for resurrection in Paul. I thought that was really a super cool thing that I sort of stumbled into.
Wow. I just interviewed a number of months ago, John Dominic Crossan, and we talked a lot about resurrected bodies and how ancient people during Paul's time would have understood it. And, it's a very different way of thinking about it than, we think about resurrection. And so it was a really fascinating conversation with him.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, this is there are people doing this stuff out there, but it's I think it's great to get the word out further.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that you learned biblically and kind of the historical context of Paul while you were writing the book. Was there anything you learned about yourself while writing this book that you didn't know before? Maybe, I know you've written a number of books, but maybe
Yeah.
there was something that came up where you're like, wow, I did not know about that about myself before.
I think in every writing project, I mean, it is a sense of discovery about material, but it's also about yourself and things that you sort of cherish and you don't even know why. Um, And I think I still wrestle with the, I was taught and raised in a tradition where, Paul has to be the sort of unadulterated good guy.
Mm,
You have to believe and agree with everything he says because he's the apostle and he has written a good chunk of the New Testament. And, I think every time I work on something, I find myself um, wrestling to say, okay, what does Paul or what does this person actually say? And do I actually have to agree with that? And why
mm.
don't I agree with that? Or why should I agree with that? And so that's something I've really learned. And it was a Jewish scholar, uh, oh my gosh, whose name is blanking. I'm blanking on his name right now, but he wrote a fantastic book called The Bodies of God. Um,
Mm.
and his argument was you have to read the Bible if you're a Jew or a Christian. You can't ignore it, but you can disagree
Was
with it.
that Benjamin Sommer
Thank
or
you,
Somer?
Benjamin Summer. I had another Benjamin in my head, and I knew it wasn't that. Benjamin Summer. His point was read it, agree with it or disagree with it, but just don't ignore it.
Mm,
Don't feel like you have to agree with everything. And that's not certainly not the sort of piety I was initially raised in, but it's something I'm still trying to navigate every time I pick up and start studying something.
mhm. I mean, it feels like sometimes like the way I wish people would read my tweets. Like it's like just read it,
Yeah,
or agree with it or not. Like I don't care, but like you don't have to freak out about it.
yeah. Well,
I feel that way about Paul then too. Like
that's right.
he and I are kindred spirits in that way.
Yeah, yeah. Ancient tweets, Paul's letters.
I mean, could you imagine Paul on Twitter? Like he would he would have to be like kind of just like this almost like Drill. I don't know if you follow Drill,
Yeah,
that account, but like it feels like Paul would be one of those shit posters if he could be.
I think that's exactly right. Yep. Yep.
So let's talk about some of the contents of the book. Obviously, you really want to drive home the Jewishness of Paul. And before we kind of dive into that part of the book where you really make this argument that Paul was like very Jewish,
Yeah.
many of my listeners, I'm guessing, probably have had bad experiences with Paul.
Yeah.
With the way that Paul has been interpreted in their lives. And at the beginning of the book, you talk about a few different perspectives
Yep.
about Paul. And one of them is the Lutheran perspective,
Yep.
where Paul is essentially pitted against Judaism, Paul against the law, and can you talk a little bit about what that perspective, that Lutheran perspective of Paul is, and why you think so many people have bad experiences with that particular perspective of Paul?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. A great question. I think most, any listener who's somehow broadly related to Protestantism knows the Lutheran Paul, even if they don't know they know the Lutheran Paul. And so it's really important to know there are different readings of Paul out there. And the Lutheran reading of Paul is essentially a couple things. One, um, Paul, before he met Jesus, thought he needed, like other Jews in his day, thought he needed to live um, a near perfect or even perfect life in
Mm,
order to be saved and to be loved by God. And so Paul seems to be happy doing this until, and then he sort of realizes I'm not doing it, kind of like Martin Luther, who
mhm,
just feels overwhelmed by his own guilt. I'm so sinful. I'm so rotten. How can I ever earn God's pleasure or favor or salvation? Um, and then, like Luther, Paul discovers, oh gosh, there's this grace thing. And all I need to do is have faith, and God will be gracious to me. And I don't have to work for it. And so there's this idea that Judaism is a religion of works righteousness. You have to
mm,
earn God's favor. And that either leads you into understandable existential depression because you know you can't do it, you know you failed, or it leads you into really obnoxious self pride, believing, tricking yourself into thinking you're very much more righteous than you actually are.
mm,
Uh, and so that's sort of the depiction of Judaism that Luther and that school of reading Paul need as the backdrop to make sense of Paul. And they say, well, here comes Paul with this message of only faith, not works, only grace, not works righteousness. And he sort of saves people from really what is a dead end, the dead end religion of Judaism. And so
mhm,
I think a lot of people hear that and think, I mean, it's sort of an interesting depiction of God, only in Christianity, only in Jesus, only in the years, well, what, 30 or so, does God finally say, oh, hold on, I'm gracious, I'm generous. You got it all wrong
Mm-hmm.
so far. And it's also like this God as this strict taskmaster, who is strict and hates everything you do except if you believe in Jesus. And then you
Mm-hmm.
get the sort of divine parental affection. And that's, I think many of us probably struggle with that sort of picture of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's how can that not be anything but deeply unhealthy?
Right. Well, and there's like kind of a hint of Marcionism in there too, like where it's like really pitting God against these two different testaments.
Yep, that's right. Ultimately, I think Luther and those people would say, no, we're not, but I don't know how else you read it.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, and it's also really interesting that eventually within Protestantism, I don't know if Luther necessarily does this, but certainly it happens in Protestantism where essentially uh, Catholicism gets equated with Judaism in this
yeah,
regard, where Catholicism is also this very works righteous kind of religion.
yeah. Well, this is the whole thing, right? We all have our enemies today, our theological opponents or whatever. And Luther, of course, had his. And so if you have your opponents, you know what they say. It's easy to go back to the Bible if that's your, well of your theology, and say,
Hmm.
well, where are my enemies here? And so, yeah, Catholicism gets associated with Judaism, and Judaism gets associated sort of with the worst aspects of the things that Luther was seeing in the Roman Catholicism of his day.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So obviously, this perspective really pits Paul against Judaism, very ironically, given the fact that Paul was a Jew.
yeah,
But obviously, your book argues that Paul is really, really Jewish. Like like really, what his theological development that you see in his letters is really just an outgrowth of his Judaism and
that's
his devout faith in Judaism. Before we kind of get into the weeds of Paul being particularly Jewish, can you talk about the multiplicity of Judaism during Paul's time? Because that seems to be really key to then eventually understanding how Paul is particularly Jewish. But yeah, can you talk a little bit about the very diverse and multiplicity of Judaism during
yeah.
Paul's time?
Yeah, I think it's so easy, especially for those of us who don't know much about modern Judaism, or any other era of Judaism. We might look back to the Christian Old Testament and say, okay, well, what is Judaism? Sort of assuming that what you read there was the Judaism of Jesus's day, or the Judaism of any other era, and that it provides sort of a unified message that everybody agreed with. Everything we know, and even the New Testament makes it very clear that Jews disagree with each other about things. There are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians. You have priests and Levites, and then not in the New Testament, but at the New Testament period, you have the Essenes, and then you have a group of people who follow this guy named Jesus. And so there there is disagreement on pretty much everything when it comes down to it. I think the 5 books of Moses would be the sort of one thing that maybe all the Jews of Jesus's day agreed on, although even there are little differences in the text that,
Mm,
for instance, the Samaritans disagreed over. And so I think for, we could get into the weeds of all these different differences, but the point is, as soon as you hear someone say something about Judaism believed X, or Judaism did Y, or Paul's problem with Judaism was this, you have to sit there and say, well, wait a minute, there's really no such thing as Judaism. There are just a whole bunch of ancient Jews. And ancient Jews, like modern Jews and like modern Christians, all have different opinions and beliefs and practices. And so to try to turn ancient Judaism into a monolithic thing that then Paul can reject or that Paul can leave really oversimplifies history.
hmm hmm. It also seems as if, I've heard this argument before from Jews that the Gospels aren't a very good portrayal of Judaism during that time. And I don't know, like, what you think from that as a scholar, but I'm really curious, like, how Judaism is really depicted in the Gospels, because then again, I think that carries over to how Christians then understand Paul and his Jewishness, because of the portrayal of Judaism in the Gospels.
Yep. Yeah, we have almost no certain writings from pre-70, before the temple was destroyed, that talk about Judaism. The Gospels, well, the Gospel of Mark is right around that period. And so it's one window in. maybe an idiosyncratic window into like what were ancient Jews saying and doing. And I think Matthew and Mark and Luke especially give some good evidence about what Jews did and what Jews believed. And so again, it shows the diversity, and it just helps us think a bit better about, well, what's Paul doing in this whole weird, messy world of
Mhm.
life.
Mhm. So obviously Judaism during this time and to this day is full of multiplicity. There's just a lot of different understandings of what it means to be Jewish. Can you talk a bit then about how Paul is particularly Jewish? Like, right? Like here
Yeah,
he is, this Jew that believes that Jesus is the Messiah. How
yeah,
is he particularly Jewish in this context?
yeah. It was one of those really funny sort of turns of history that we've taken all these writings. I think every piece of writing in the New Testament is written by a Jewish believer in Jesus. We've taken all these texts and quickly forgotten that they're written by actual ancient Jews, and then forgotten that when they're talking about Jews and they're talking about non-Jews, um, the behavior they're actually and beliefs they're usually talking about are particularly and distinctively Jewish beliefs. Paul repeatedly talks about, the God of Israel, the God of the Jews. He talks about Jews. He talks about figures that are Jews, whether it's Abraham or Isaac. Um, these Moses, these are all Jewish things that only make sense within a Jewish milieu, and his morality, which we often, I think of as just sort of, I mean, it's Christian morality, right? But we think of it as that's how we think of it, not thinking of it as, well, it was also probably broadly construed, fit well with what most other Jews believed around questions of morality. And so it's really hard to step sort of 2000 years back in time and think about yourself as like a Gentile, a non-Jew living in Rome or Galatia or somewhere, and you're hearing this guy talk about all these things that are entirely Jewishly coded, and they may not be that familiar to you depending on how well you know things about Jews. But to any non-Jewish reader or listener or person talking to Paul in the ancient world, everything about what Paul's doing is Jewish. A
Mm,
Gentile who becomes part of this move, or becomes a member of this movement, is entering into a fundamentally, at the end of the day, fundamentally Jewish world. The scriptures, these are Jewish scriptures. They're not anybody else's scriptures. And so
right.
uh, that's all this is the evidence that Paul is still Jewish. And he never uses the term Christian,
Mhm.
not once. We don't even know if it was bouncing around in Paul's day, or maybe Paul didn't know about it. Maybe he did, and he didn't actually like the term. But either way, he doesn't see it as, I've left Judaism for something completely different. Uh, a church with steeples and all that. He's still in the Jewish world in his mind, at least.
Right. What are some very distinctly, or what we think because we're so far removed from that context
Yeah.
of Paul's time, what are some what we would consider very distinctly Christian theological concepts like Jesus is Lord or Jesus is the Messiah or Savior, like uh whatever those concepts are that we think are particularly Christian, but are actually very rooted in Judaism.
Yeah.
And Paul talks obviously extensively about. So can you talk about, or even being like born again, whatever that is?
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how some of those concepts that we think are very distinctively Christian are actually rooted in Judaism, and why Paul thinks about them, obviously in a Jewish way?
Yeah. Wow, that's a great question. And it depends how you want to answer that. And I could wiggle around like a historian is trained to do, but I'll just sort of answer it a little less carefully than I would maybe in a history seminar. Um, things like repentance and
Mm,
sin. These are words that, sure, they're outside of the Jewish world, but they have a particularly coded meaning within the Jewish world, or a range of meanings within the Jewish world. Things like sacrifice and temple. When Paul talks about, for instance, in First Corinthians, that these believers are the temple of God, um, he's evoking, at the very least, the Jerusalem temple, which still stands and is very prominent. And so, he talks about God as the supreme God. There were non-Jews who believed in a supreme God as well, even though there were lower deities. And I think most, if not all, ancient Jews held to that same thing, including
mm.
Paul. Um, but I mean, at every aspect, it's Jewish through and through. It's just been adopted by Christians, and then Christians forget that that's actually Jewish.
It seems as if Paul understanding Jesus as the Messiah, again, again, this is a very Jewish thing. W- Like, how does Paul differentiate himself then from like other Jews who obviously rejected Jesus as the Messiah? Like again, like it just seems like this very internal debate that's happening, and it's hard to imagine it that way because we think of someone like saying that Jesus is the Messiah would be a completely different religion. But
Right.
it again, it's such an internal debate. So can you talk a little bit about how, yeah, that like, you know, a theological claim like that, that Jesus is the Messiah is very distinctly Jewish, and like how other Jews that even rejected it would have understand
Right.
the Messiah or something
Yeah.
along those
So
lines.
that's a great example, Mason. The messianic language is actually almost exclusively Jewish. Um, so when Paul talks about Jesus as the Messiah or Christ, um, these are words that only make sense sort of within a Jewish worldview. And so to non-Jews, they have to buy into at least parts of Jewish thinking to even get this. And so that's really important. And we, of course, translate Messiah as Christ and then forget. We just think it's Jesus's last name or something akin to that. Um, this is very Jewish. Now, the question, of course, is who's Messiah? Who is the Messiah? And how do we know that? And that's where the struggles for Paul begin. So I think most of Paul's beliefs would have fallen generally within the acceptable range of Jewish options in the first century. The claim that Jesus is the Messiah, this really was the sticking point, and this is what leads to eventually over time the parting of the ways between Jews and Christians. If you think Jesus is the Messiah and other people don't think Jesus is the Messiah, it becomes sort of hard to share synagogue space. And worship the God of Israel over something that's like pretty substantive disagreement.
Mhm.
How do you get along, and sort of respect those differences when it's something so massive?
What makes that messianic claim so, I mean, we talked a little bit about how there's so much disagreement among Judaism,
Yep.
and yet it still remains Jewish.
Yeah.
But then there's this claim that Jesus is the Messiah, and somehow that is the one disagreement that actually completely changes the trajectory, where now it's gonna actually end up being its own religion.
Yep.
What is it about that claim amongst Judaism during that time that makes it so divisive?
Uh, I'm going to put this like in a really blunt way. The stupidity of it.
Mm,
It's stupid. Jesus was crucified on a Roman cross. He lost. How could he possibly be the Messiah? Um, it's a very outlandish claim. And so, uh, okay, Paul and others are claiming, well, he's been raised from the dead. And 500 of us saw it, well, or saw him at some point. Well, great. What about everybody else? And why hasn't the world changed? Rome still has its thumb on us or its boot on our neck. We're seeing the misery of the world. When the Messiah comes, we expect some form of like dramatic cosmological change, not some sort of mere wishy-washy inner kingdom of God inside of us. Um, it should be something I think much more groundbreaking and revolutionary and like something you can't just dismiss. And
mhm.
so I think you know really what's happening is people are living in two very different realities, and how does that not lead to conflict over time? And of
Mhm.
course, I mean, the other issue is that this movement of Jesus followers becomes increasingly non-Jewish in terms of who's participating in it. And over time, that's going to look like, well, you're saying you're the faithful remnant or whatever language you want to use of Judaism, but you're mostly non-Jews. And perhaps some of those non-Jews are thinking, man, it's really inconvenient to keep calling ourselves or keep thinking about ourselves in terms in relation to these Jews who don't like us or don't accept us and don't believe in our Messiah. Let's just like split off from them and maybe
Mhm.
call ourselves the true Israel and tell them that those are actually, no, we're reading the Bible right, you're not. And you can see, whoops, I'm getting agitated. You can see how it could just build up over time into animosity and then finally just breaking apart so that there's not this sort of daily tension happening in synagogues.
Hmm. You're already sort of answering my next
Yes.
question, which was like, do you see in Paul's letters him laying the foundation for Christianity to become its
Yeah.
own religion and distinct from Judaism? I don't know if you have more to say about that, but I do kind of have a follow-up question around that. But yeah, do you see Paul laying that foundation, even though he doesn't see this movement being something that's a completely different religion? Clearly, he sees this as part of the Jewish tradition,
Yeah.
but do you see the groundwork already starting to be laid for that to happen?
Yeah. Um, I think the way I would answer it is that Paul says things in his letters that are easily taken in different directions than Paul would take them in. Like any text, as soon as you send it out there, you no longer control how it's read and narrated,
Mhm.
and you're not on a phone, so you can't. Oh no, that's not what I meant. You can't correct it easily or quickly. Once Paul's letters are unleashed, they do their own thing, and people do their own thing with those texts. And so I think Paul would be absolutely upset about how they've been used, but he said some things in ways that made it really easy for later believers in Jesus, and especially later non-Jewish believers in Jesus, to all of a sudden say, wait a minute, Paul's condemning those guys over there. We're the true Israel. We're the true sons of Abraham.
Mm.
And the Jews are rebellious and have been rejected by God, or something along those lines.
So, I mean, it's impossible to know exactly what Paul meant by really anything he said because he's not alive. But do you see Paul getting a sense that this movement could become its own thing,
Ah,
its own? Do you even sense that
yeah.
in Paul's letters at all?
I would say,
This could possibly become distinct from Judaism.
I would say no. And I guess one of the main reasons I say no, and this is something I work out in the book a little bit, is I don't think Paul thought that far in the future. I think he thought the future was here. It was basically over. And when you read Romans 9 through 11, how much of it is rhetorical and how much of it is something Paul actually believed. I think he thinks the end is nigh, and the Messiah is going to return. The resurrected Messiah is going to return, and all Israel is going to believe. And this really weird situation we have ourselves in is going to be beautifully resolved, and there's going to be a nice bow wrapped on it, and it's going to be a happy ending. And so I don't think he saw a split. I don't think he even could imagine it because he couldn't think that far into the future.
You just mentioned Romans,
Yeah.
and obviously Romans is one of those books that, or one of those letters that we know was written by Paul.
Yep.
How do you take into account all the Deutero-Pauline letters
Yeah.
into this thesis that Paul's very Jewish? Like, how do you take that into account? Like, are those letters, do we just ignore them because we know they weren't written by Paul, or likely weren't? Do we take those into account of trying to figure out the Jewishness of Paul? Like, I'm just curious, how do you understand these Deutero-Pauline letters when you're trying to make this thesis that Paul is very Jewish?
Yeah. Great question. So I don't think the pastorals were written by Paul. Um, Second Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians, I mean, I don't care a whole lot, but I guess is one answer. But I just don't know, and I don't really know how we could be certain, apart from sort of earlier theological presuppositions, which I think uh, play a large role in these debates. I think so in my book, I mention all of these letters at times, but more in sort of like a supplementary way of, okay, whether Paul wrote these or not, look at how whether it's Paul or an earlier, relatively early follower of Paul's, um, says things that sort of uh, confirm certain things that I'm trying to claim in the book, or show what Paul may be saying in this passage better. And so I don't lose a whole lot of sleep over it. I think there are some, difficult passages maybe in Ephesians and Colossians around, well, how is this still a Jewish Paul here? It sort of sounds a little more pointed towards, I think, his fellow Jews than his other letters.
So do you have a sense that the writers, the likely writers of those letters that are obviously writing as if they are Paul, do you get a sense that like maybe they are what like one of these types of Christians that might be like maybe an like
Right.
a Gentile who is trying to kind of push this agenda of trying to essentially pit this movement against Judaism? Like, do you get a
Yeah.
sense that maybe some of these Paul, like Deutero-Pauline authors are actually maybe trying to push that agenda? Because it does seem like in some of those Deutero-Pauline letters, like they're pushing this a little differently than what we do know from the actual Pauline letters.
Yep. You know, that's a great question. Um, I think I think in ways that Paul, I think they take some of the things that Paul was saying in Romans and Galatians, for instance, and they sort of kick that ball further down the road, um, to maybe, we want to really put a stop to these things that Paul was fighting against, and we're still fighting. So, even Ephesians, for instance, whether Paul wrote it or not, there's still this tension between Jews and Gentiles, even within this Jesus movement. There are scholars who argue this. I think it's right that the Jews were calling the Gentiles a bunch of foreskins, and the Gentiles were calling the Jews the circumcision. And so it sort of taps into that long, venerable tradition of ethnic slurs based
Hmm.
on, bodily distinctives. And so I think there's that tension there. And Ephesians maybe is trying to say, come on, I will do whatever it takes to get this to stop, and I'll go further than Paul, perhaps, in um, erasing the Jew-Gentile boundary in ways that Paul still thinks ethnicity matters, and I think Ephesians is trying to say, nice try, Paul. That only works if Jesus comes back very soon, and he hasn't. So, we just got to get rid of the whole Jew-Gentile thing. It's got to stop. It's not it'd be very messy, I think, on the ground if you try to think through the logistics of what it would be like. I think what Paul envisioned his churches to be like would be very messy and very difficult.
Judaism has always had people converting into the
Yep.
religion. And so people who were not born ethnically Jewish have converted, and that has happened for a long time, and it certainly happened during Jesus's and Paul's time. What I find interesting about this whole like debate that's happening during this time amongst Christians and Jews is even though that's always happened, there's something about Christianity though that is uh it seems to like ramp up
Yeah.
this like divide even more than it's ever have. And I'm like trying to get my head around like why is it that Christianity came around and uh was open to all these non-Jewish people being a part of the movement, and yet like like something changed so drastically in Christianity when it came to that,
Yeah.
in comparison to Judaism, where again Judaism has always had converts who are not Jewish come in, but it seems like Christianity is like like either making claims that are different or like its practice was different, where now all of a sudden that is like a tension. And again, like you're pointing out, like this is such a tension where it's like, well, maybe like it's going to actually just be a completely different religion. Anyway, I'm sort of like word
Yeah.
vomiting at this point, but and rambling. But I like that is like a thing that I've been thinking about through all of this is the fact that yeah, there's something about Christianity's either theological claim or its practice that really makes this ethnicity piece different than what has historically happened in Judaism.
Yeah. So Jews, again, this is one of those places where you can't say Jews believed. Jews did. Jews disagreed even before Jesus, and definitely before Paul. They disagreed over Gentiles and conversion. I
Mm,
think probably the majority thought fine, leading up to the time of Jesus. Um, but at least some, I don't know how big a group, at least some thought, well, not necessary. You don't need to. And this is a very important distinction between Judaism and Christianity that I think we fail to keep in mind. Christians traditionally have thought if you're Christian, you're saved. If you're not Christian, you're damned. And that is not something we actually see in ancient Judaism or modern Judaism generally.
Mm.
Um, you could be a righteous non-Jew and you didn't have to keep the Jewish law, which was for Jews. So A, you should convert. B, you don't have to convert. And then there's another category of, I think, very exclusive thinking that Gentiles can't possibly convert.
Mm.
You can't turn, this is an analogy I use sometimes, a non-kosher pig into a kosher cow by circumcising it, or cutting it up the right way for food. It's still a pig. And some Jewish writers thought this way about Gentiles. And so I think those same debates are happening in the early Jesus movement. What do we do with these guys? And of
Mm.
course, so I think one thing you're noticing, Mason, is it's become much more of a pressing issue on a couple of fronts. One, there are more Gentiles coming in, at least in relation to Paul's ministry. Not exclusively, but especially with Paul's ministry. It's not just one or two Gentiles, it's these whole communities of Gentiles who believe in Jesus now. And so the numbers make it a bigger issue. What are we gonna do? We can't just have them all sort of as second-rate citizens who believe in God, the God of Israel, but don't convert to Judaism. But so then should they convert to Judaism? Should the men undergo circumcision, etc.? And so this is, I think, the conversation we're seeing part of with Paul. It's well, what do we do with these guys? It's the eschaton, the end of the age. Do they need to become Jews at the end of the age? Are they righteous Gentiles at the end of the age? And how do we all live together until Jesus comes back?
Mm. Do you get like I know there isn't like a clean break, but is there at any point you see historically where that it just becomes kind of obvious, like this is a different thing?
Yeah.
Is there again, like I know that it's not like there's this moment, there's like this,
Oh,
but there's got to be like a time period or something where it's like this really is starting to feel like this is a different thing, and
yeah.
maybe it's a few hundred years after Paul or not. I'm not sure, but I'm really curious if you have a sense around that.
Yeah. So this is the old conundrum that's called the parting of the ways in scholarship. When did it happen and how did it happen? And I think traditionally it's been Jesus or Paul. And then it sort of has been pushed into the 2nd century. And now people are talking 4th century or even later. I just think it's just downright messy. Uh, and so, there's a great edited volume called The Ways That Never Parted that's trying to
Mm.
say you can't even talk about this is the moment it split. And I think that's ultimately right. I co-edited another volume that sort of tongue-in-cheek in reaction to it called The Ways That Often Parted. And both are I think sort of the same thing. There's just messiness. And so one region, there might be a town down the road where the synagogue says, we can't do this anymore. You Jesus people, you got to get out of here. Or the Jesus people say to the non-Jesus people, you got to get out of here.
Mm.
And then there are 2 different synagogues. But that's just one town or one region, and there might be something very different happening elsewhere. And so we even see, as late as John Chrysostom and others, we have these Christian writers just pulling out their hair because they go to preach on Sunday morning, and half the people in their congregation were at synagogue the day before. And so, they're
Mm.
annoyed on a number of levels. One, their authority is undermined, and it's undermined a day earlier. The Jewish synagogue is always getting to them one day earlier. And so, I guess they have the final say of that week, but the tension just we keep seeing it, I think, even in the 4th, 5th century, but very sporadic. And I think you're right. Like, these are the sort of, borderline cases. I think most people already at this time have a clear, this is Judaism, this is Christianity. And you can see like the literature written by rabbis and early Christians it's pretty remarkably different. What interests they have and how they go about making arguments. There are some similarities, but it's very different too.
Mm-hmm. I've seen claims before, not that it's, even a majority or anything, but I have seen claims before from Jews that Paul is anti-Semitic,
Yep.
and maybe you've heard similar claims before. How would you respond to that and
Yeah.
those claims, given the fact that you're thinking, "No, Paul is super Jewish."
Yeah. Yeah. What a great question. I actually I have to write an essay on this for next summer, so I need someone to give me an answer. Um, I'm not Jewish, and so part of me wants to be very careful and say, if a modern Jew reads Paul and says this is anti-Semitic, who am I to say it's
Mm,
not? So that's one, thing I want to be very careful about and sensitive to. But on the other hand, I think so. Now I'm going to undermine my sensitivity. I think we've been taught to read Paul this way, and I think even Jews who didn't grow up in a church or didn't study Christian theology have been so deeply affected by Christian supersessionism and Christian anti-Semitism and Christian anti-Semitic uses of Paul that it's hard, especially if you're not a scholar, to step back and say, well, wait a minute, maybe those are the wrong readings of Paul. And okay, maybe I'm reading Paul through those lenses, even though I never asked to put those stupid lenses on in the first place. Um, so I think about scholars like Jewish scholars like Paula Fredrickson, Mark Nanos, and others who are really trying to show, place Paul in his first century context and say he's not anti-Jewish, he's not anti-Semitic. Um, he's been read that way for sure, and his passages could be stated that way. The thing is, Paul thinks Jesus is the Messiah. There's no way around it. But in that day and age, there's no 2,000 years of Christian anti-Judaism using Jesus as a cudgel against Jews. And so, um, I don't think Paul was anti-Semitic, and I think we've misunderstood his words, especially Christians have. And so I
mhm.
don't blame anybody else for misunderstanding Paul if Christians can't get him right.
Mhm. Well, along those lines then, how do you think understanding Paul as a Jew could change Christians' relationship with Jews today?
Yeah. Um, so this sort of goes back to that first question you asked about Luther. It is so fundamental to Christian theology that there is something, and there was something, and there is something wrong with Judaism. It's
Mm,
works righteousness or something else. And the other something else that a lot of people put forward is that it's ethnocentric, which is a lot of syllables to say racist, and prejudiced and things like that. Um, and that's Paul's problem. So, N.T. Wright, very, very popular Christian writer, used to say, I don't think he says it anymore to his credit, that Paul preached grace, not race. Which, of course,
mhm.
since the sort of 60s and 70s, where we've become very aware of racism and colonialism, that's an important thing to talk about in Paul. But that suggests Judaism is all about race, so very, very negatively coded, and it's ethnocentric and it's particularistic, unlike Christianity, which is universalistic. If we throw all that out and we just think, does Paul have sort of a problem with Judaism? I think the answer is no, because he thinks he's one. His problem is he thinks the Messiah has come, and many of his, not all, but many of his fellow Jews just haven't recognized it. But he
Mhm.
doesn't demonize them. He doesn't say they're rotten and sinful. Um, and they only don't accept Jesus because I'm riffing off of a tweet I saw recently. Maybe you were the one who reposted it. They only rejected the Messiah because they want to delve into sexual sins, or something like that. There's no sort of moralizing about why the Jews don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. Paul thinks it's an absolute mystery, and he thinks it's ultimately up to uh, the God of the Jews. The God of the Jews has temporarily kept many from believing. So if it's anybody's fault, ultimately, Paul is, I think, saying it's God's, and it's a mystery. So I don't think that's like, I think there are still issues there, and there are still, hazards there in terms of Jewish Christian conversation, dialogue, respect. But it's not a demonization of Judaism. It's not a demonization of Jews, that Paul's wrestling with.
Yeah, again, I think it's this internal debate that's happening, and I think you see it all the time, even in the Gospels between Jesus and other Jews,
Totally.
in all any stories that he's interacting with other Jews is that he's just This is an internal debate. Like the tension and that you see in these stories is not Judaism versus Jesus or Judaism versus Christianity. It's Jews against Jews
Yeah.
debating with each other, and that's what Jews do. Like that is just a long tradition of that.
Yep, exactly. And it's just that has turned. I think there's something really malignant that happens as soon as that internal debate jumps the fence, and now Gentiles have these debates or part of these debates in their
Mm,
hands. Then they get weaponized against Jews.
right.
So it's um, yeah, something very perverse happens and has for 2,000 years happened there.
Mhm. At the beginning, I mentioned, a lot of my listeners probably have felt like Paul has been weaponized against them, like,
Yep.
that they felt, like they were just wretched sinners, all the time because of Paul's, the way that Paul was taught to them. How do
Yeah.
you think understanding Paul as a Jew could help people maybe appreciate Paul again and not, I think of a lot of the ex-evangelical people really hating Paul, but I think
Yeah.
understanding Paul in this way maybe gives a sense of like, oh, maybe Paul wasn't actually as bad of a guy as I think he was
Yeah.
growing up, or the way I was taught that he was.
Yeah. 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 Paul's not my favorite guy. Um, and I've been trying to be very careful about, Matt, don't turn Paul into the good guy for you. Um, you
Mm,
know, I could easily translate him if I wanted to, in sort of into an anti-Trumpian, anti-conservative Paul, or I could try. Um, and yet that doesn't necessarily have. It might have some value for today, but that's not necessarily fair to Paul. Um, I think he's weird. He's different than what we expect, and that alone might give us pause about how others have used Paul against us or against others, against marginalized people, and how we might be using Paul against the oppressed ourselves. And so we think we know Paul and we don't is, I think, one important step in sort of um, a life of charity and humility. I do think Paul really does value difference. Um, he wants Gentiles to remain Gentiles. He thinks they need to, and he thinks Jews should remain Jews. And so there's something about difference there. Now it's a Jewish conception of difference, mind you, in the first century CE. But there's something there that's really valuable, I think, for us today. And so, uh, yeah, so we're all wretched sinners. I do think that's sort of one of Paul's key points. Um, He's an anthropological pessimist, as one scholar puts it.
mhm,
But the point is really not to dwell on that. It's to dwell on the unparalleled and unending love and grace of God in Christ and the gift of the Messiah that is available, no matter who you think you are, or
mhm,
no matter who others think you are.
mhm,
So there are some texts in Paul that can be used as a hammer, and we might use them against ourselves as a hammer. But I don't think that's what Paul. Those are steps in arguments for Paul's conclusions, not where Paul really wants you to stay stuck.
mhm,
As you always need to keep in mind, like Luther did, that you are a wretched, awful human being.
mhm.
I actually don't think Paul would. I may be wrong. I don't think Paul really would have, been that kind of a preacher on a regular basis.
Well, I don't think Paul was much of a Calvinist, but that's just me.
Jonathan Edwards popped into my mind when I was saying that. So there you go. Yeah,
Well, that Lutheran perspective of Paul that we were talking about at the beginning does seem to imply that Paul is clear. And right at the beginning of the book, you talk about how I think it was like Second Peter was the passage, but you
yeah,
talk about how Paul like is not clear, and this really goes against that doctrine of biblical clarity. But
yeah,
uh, I think that at the very least, understanding Paul in this way of him being very Jewish, having this internal debate within Judaism during his time, and there's going to be a lack of clarity there
yeah,
about what he's teaching, and I don't know necessarily if Paul all the time knows exactly what he believes in every given moment,
yeah,
and so I think that at least we should like give Paul a little grace, and not then weaponize him, thinking he is clear and he knows exactly what he believes at all times, and it never changes. I think we should give Paul a little bit more grace than that, that he's actually, at the end of the day, a human and probably is a lot like us in that way, where sometimes we don't know what we absolutely believe, and sometimes we aren't exactly clear on what we believe.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, and they're letters, right? They're occasional letters written to certain people at a certain time. They're not tweets, but they're not that far from tweets or an email you might send. And I would hate to
Right.
be judged on my tweets or my emails or DMs, you know?
Let's hope that God does not bring those up when we get to heaven. Matthew, how do you hope a Jewish Paul inspires and liberates its readers?
Yeah. So, you mentioned ex-evangelicals who often hate Paul. I hope maybe it gives Paul a second chance with such readers.
Mm,
Um, for any current evangelicals or conservatives who think they love Paul, I'd love for them to read the book and think, oh, maybe I don't know Paul as well as I do, or maybe I'm loving the wrong things about Paul.
mm,
Um, yeah, those last few sort of back and forths we've had, I think, have stressed some of the humility and tentativeness of Christianity, and I think uh, that's really important to the Christian life because Paul thought the world was going to end in the first century uh, or near the first century at the latest. And he was wrong. And we've been trying to figure out what to do ever since. And it's a
mm,
grand experiment that we've really screwed up over and over and over again. And maybe thinking about what does it mean that we're still sort of waiting for the end? We think it's near. Um, what does that mean for our not only our certainty, but how we live gently, kindly, and graciously in the world?
hmm Well, and especially too, I think that this book, again, situating Paul within his Judaism and within his Jewishness, is really illuminates like, oh, I need to do this in my relationship with Jews. Like, I really do think it can inspire and liberate people in that way. For Christians to kind of reimagine their relationship with Jews, given the fact that this Paul guy was very, very Jewish,
Yeah.
and understanding his theology out of that context of Judaism, I think it's just super helpful then of reimagining our relationship with Jews as Christians.
Yeah. That's the answer I should have given.
Well, that I really liked your answer though too. Like I think again, like for those of us who grew up in evangelicalism and are very, very oftentimes frustrated with Paul and the way that Paul was taught, I think this really illuminates a different kind of version of Paul that I think we should maybe give a little bit more grace to him than we sometimes do as ex-evangelicals. So, Matthew, how can listeners get connected to you and your work?
I'm on Twitter too much.
You're a
And,
great follow, by the way, man.
and there are a few books I've written online that you can get at Amazon or anywhere else. But Twitter and Facebook, but mostly Twitter.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for chatting more about the book. Just an incredible book. I definitely, I already am thinking about like a number of people that I definitely want to uh, give my copy to and
Cool.
have them check it out, but just because it's so good. So thank you so much for chatting more about the book.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.